This is Unit 2.2, Theme 2, Oregon, the Texas Revolution and the Mexican War. This is George Crofut's American Progress or Manifest Destiny, drawn in 1873. It's about westward expansion. We have this lady here flying towards the west, and you can see technology sort of pushing towards the west. And with this technology comes civilization, and the Native Americans are running probably kind of the, this is the Jacksonian image of westward expansion and the displacement of Native Americans. We've talked a couple of times about this concept of manifest destiny. It actually comes from a newspaper article written by John O'Sullivan around 1850 or so. And in this, he said, it is our manifest destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. Essentially what he's saying is that it is our destiny, it is a foregone conclusion that we will take over the continent because of Providence, which is a 19th century way of saying God. God gave us this right to take it over because of our yearly multiplying millions, because our population is getting so big, we're so great, and we're getting so populous that it is our divine right to move out west and take over that territory. This is a predominant belief throughout the early half of the American experiment. The ideology had been around since the first settlers, and it's discussed with the Proclamation of 1763, the idea that we have this right to move out west. And it's this belief in a God-given right to all the land in North America. It's very ethnocentric, which means Americans believe that we were better than those other people out west. Remember, there's Native Americans, there's French, there's Spanish, there's the British in Oregon. But get out of the way because the Americans have a God-given right to take that over. That's the essential concept of manifest destiny. Not everybody believed it at the time, but it was the way that people thought, the majority of Americans thought at the time. We talked about Oregon in the last theme. Remember, this is the United States settling with Britain over the Oregon Territory to avoid a fight because the United States wanted to fight with Mexico over Texas and California. So let's talk about the Texas Revolution. Texas was an interesting situation because Mexico invited Americans to move to Texas around 1822. At that point, Texas was a province in Mexico. Yes, Americans immigrated to Mexico, and they promised to live by Mexican law. The people that tended to move to Texas were southern planters, so they wanted to grow cotton, like we see here. They wanted more valuable land for that cotton, which meant they needed to have slavery extended into the territories. We can see here the expansion of cotton. This is cotton production in 1820, so we only have these little patches. But by 1860, the entire South was producing cotton, which means, if you notice this map, slavery tended to be on the East Coast, but by the time of 1860, slavery is spreading here. If you compare the two maps, you'll notice that slavery tends to be cotton tends to be a very slave heavy enterprise. So this led to a lot of tensions. To get this valuable land, Texans had, these American immigrants, we call them Texans now, had to agree to follow Mexican laws. There are three main things that they had to do. Convert to Catholicism. No way. These are Protestants. They're proud to be Protestant, but they said that they would, and then once they get there, they change their mind. They agree to pay Mexican taxes and follow Mexican law, maybe, but they don't like it. And the last thing is that Mexico, after the Mexicans changed their government, they emancipated all their slaves. So the Texans were supposed to emancipate their slaves. Out of the question. These are cotton plantation owners. Without their slaves, the economics don't work, and besides, it's their way of life. It's what they've always done. They would much rather revolt, and they did. The war began in 1835, only 13 years after they promised to follow all Mexican laws. And it ended in 1836. There was a battle at the Alamo in which the Americans were heavily outnumbered and they're decimated. And this is where we get that whole remember the Alamo saying. Why the Alamo is important is not because the Americans lost, but because how Southern Americans living in the United States reacted. They flooded into Texas. Even though the United States government refused to support the Texans, and we'll get into why in a minute, the Americans from the South largely and overwhelmingly supported the Texans and flooded into Texas to help fight. Remember, Southerners and cotton and Texans and cotton. It's that slave thing. In the end, the Texans captured the Mexican president Santa Anna and forced him to recognize an independent Republic of Texas. When Santa Anna was released from being captured, he claimed that the treaties were coerced and thus were invalid. Interesting, he nullified the treaties. This leads to an interesting situation. The Mexicans were too weak to keep fighting. They didn't like Texas, but they were too weak to go try to take it back. They recognized this area here as Texas. The Texans recognized all this land to the Rio Grande as Texas. So there's this disputed zone here, and the Mexicans are too weak to do anything about it. Texas immediately wanted to join up with the United States of America. They were Americans. They were tied into the Southern plantation lifestyle. The United States said, no way. The United States did not want to annex Texas, which annex means to take over, to let them join. Texas represented a very large slave state. And at this point, the United States was attempting to maintain something referred to as a balance of power. They wanted equal numbers of slave states and free states in order to balance out the political issues in mainly the Senate. More on this later. Texas would throw off this balance of power in favor of the slave states and then cause a whole mess of problems for American politics. So Texas was independent. Texas takes pride in this idea of being independent for 10 years before they were annexed by the country. They claim to be the only independent country ever allowed into the United States, and it's technically true, but it's slightly misleading. The entire southwestern corner used to be Mexico. Hawaii was its own independent country before we took it over, and so there's, I don't know how much I buy into that. Polk in 1844, though, was elected promising to expand the United States westward. This is sort of the really end of the Manifest Destiny ideology. Towards 1844, he's promising to expand westward, and he pushes for an annexation of Texas. When he gets elected, he has to follow through with this. He does some pretty sketchy things to get Texas annexed. He promised Texas would be annexed, and he follows through with it. But remember, we had that balance of power issue. So only southern states were really going to vote for Texas to come in. So rather than the correct way of requiring a 2/3 majority of both houses to let Texas in, he pushes through a joint resolution which only required a majority vote. So it's kind of a shady situation. The correct way would have failed, so he pushes it through the other way. And this leads to an increasing tension with Mexico as well, as throwing off that balance of power. Because Polk sent an emissary, a diplomat, to Mexico to try to buy all this territory over here. He wanted California because of the gold, because there's a large gold supply that had just been discovered. Mexico told him no, and told him to go away. This irritated Polk, and he sent troops into this disputed zone right here. Remember, Mexico sees this as being Mexican. Texas sees it as being Texas. The Americans decided to take the Texas borders, which means all of this disputed territory Polk said was his. They wanted more land for cotton anyway, and it allowed for this to happen. When Polk sent those troops into that disputed zone, all of a sudden there's this question. Are these American troops on Mexican soil? Or are these American troops on American soil? The Mexicans interpreted this as an invasion of their sovereign territory. So Mexican troops fired on the Americans. And when this happened, Polk claimed that it was an act of war. This is American blood being shed on American soil. Or was it? A young congressman named Abraham Lincoln demanded to see where the spot of the blood was shed, and then he was arguing that it was an unjust war. The United States, however, was not convinced. The United States actually declared war on Mexico, easily defeated the Mexican military, going so far as actually surrounding the capital of Mexico City. The United States easily could have captured Mexico, but they didn't want to have to deal with it. So they only wanted this territory up here. So what were the peace treaty conditions? We call it the Mexican Cession. The United States essentially paid $10 million. It's kind of hush money in order to get this Mexican Cession territory. Texas was established. That was already established by annexation. But the United States also got this entire territory here from Mexico, later solidified with the Gadsden Purchase. It makes up a big chunk of a number of territories: New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, California. All of this was part of the peace treaty negotiations. But after the Mexican War, the United States and Mexico don't like each other. Mexico perceived the United States as a bully. In fact, by the time of Teddy Roosevelt in 1900, most Latin American countries see the United States as a bully. The United States sees Mexico as weak and uncivilized. In fact, prior to World War I, Wilson tries to teach them to elect good men, which is a bit condescending. During World War I, the Germans sent a Zimmermann note trying to use that animosity to get the Mexicans to attack the United States. Remember, it's only 60 years or so between when the United States had the Mexican War and when World War I occurs. Even this has a role. This even has a role in the modern controversy over illegal immigration. Right, this is the territory here where most of the illegal immigration debate occurs. This did impact American domestic issues as well. The westward expansion is going to cause a lot of issues with that balance of power, and we'll pick up with that later.